Hi, everyone. On today's podcast, we're going to talk with Naoma Kleisner and Mohamed Koraichi about their breech vaginal birth experience. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. I am so excited to talk with Naoma and Mohamed today about their breech vaginal birth experience. If there are any detailed content or trigger warnings about this episode, we always post those in the show notes. And now I'd like to introduce our honored guests, Naoma Kleisner and Mohamed Koraichi. Naoma recently graduated with her master's in nursing in 2023 and has a background in research. After learning that their son was breached 25 weeks pregnancy, Naoma and Mohamed were surprised to learn that no in-state providers were willing to do a vaginal delivery. This led them to begin researching vaginal breech birth options and ultimately led to them giving birth at a hospital in another state. Today, we're going to talk with Naoma and Mohamed about their unique experience and how evidence-based birth resources help their family in their decision-making process. Naoma and Mohamed, welcome to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast.
We're happy to be here.
Happy to be here, sorry.
Yeah. So I am so excited that you're here to share your story with our listeners because you had a very unique experience. Can you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey into parenthood?
It was actually kind of a surprise. So we've been married for almost 4 years now. And I was finishing up nursing school, and then I learned we were pregnant. So we kind of just went from there. And
okay.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, we learned at 3 a.m. Yeah. I woke up and she's like, "Oh, I'm pregnant."
Yeah, that's when I took the test. Probably not the best time, but
I was in the middle of the night. You're a little confused, but it started you on your journey. And then you mentioned to me that you found out your baby was breech at 25 weeks. What were your thoughts at that time?
I mean, me personally, I was worried because I just had this, I don't know, they kept telling me he will turn and things like that. And I was like, I don't think so. For some reason, I just had a feeling like he wouldn't. And I don't know why. But I think I was very nervous because I knew in the US there wasn't as many options if your baby was breech. I have friends overseas, and so I knew in the UK and things like that, they were starting to do vaginal breech birth again, whereas I knew in the US it was kind of you would still get an automatic C-section. So I was worried, what would I do if the baby didn't turn, was more what I was feeling.
Yeah. Mohamed?
For me, it's the same thing. It was something new to me, so I didn't know much about it, and so I started learning from my wife about it. I was not worried because I always have kind of hope things will be good, and we had time. So I was like, all right, he's gonna turn. It's just maybe he's comfortable in that position for now. But later on, we learned that the more time is spent in this pregnancy and the baby is not turned, then the less chance that he will be turning. And that was kind of stressful, especially for my wife.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting, Naoma, you mentioned your intuition, telling you that your baby was going to stay breech, even though, having a baby in a breech position at 25 weeks is fairly common, but most of the time they turn. But as Mohamed said, as time goes on, the chances go down. And so what were you doing and researching as, your pregnancy progressed and your baby was still breech? What things were you trying?
I mean, I did spinning babies. I think everybody who's baby's breech ends up doing it. We had the ironing board. I was upside down.
Yeah, I come from work. I open the door. I find my wife upside down every day.
Every day.
Yeah, I was trying that. I did other stuff too. I had tried acupuncture. Moxa. We did that at one point. Massage. I did a few times even. And none of it really was working, so, but I think we were consistent with it till the very end. I remember...
Yeah. Every day
we were doing that until I went into labor.
Yeah.
So how did you first come across evidence-based birth, and what drew you to explore the resources here?
I was in nursing school, and during our labor and delivery rotation, one of the professors had mentioned, oh, you might want to check out this podcast that has information about like some of the things that we do on the floor, so you can kind of familiarize yourself with some of the practices. And so I started listening to it then, because I didn't have any kids at the time, so like I wasn't familiar at all with labor and delivery, so I thought it would be good to listen. And so I thought it interesting. And then when I was pregnant, I started listening to it again, just because it had a lot of information that I found useful.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful that your nursing professor introduced you to it. That's always like makes my day when I hear that students are using it as a resource. So when your baby was breached, were there any specific episodes or things you learned from the podcast that you found helpful?
I listened to the one with Dr. Freeze, and I forgot the Dr. Hayes. I think Hayes.
Dr. Hayes, yeah.
Yeah. I listened to that one, and then I also listened to the ECV one as well, because we did do one. We did that at, I think, 37 weeks, 4 days. I did an ECV.
37, 36.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about the ECV then. What was that experience like?
So what had happened was we had eventually found a provider, or like a hospital that was willing to do vaginal breech birth. And when I had consulted, I was working with the midwives, and then they wanted me though to consult with the OB, because they told me at the birth there would have to be an OB and the midwife. And so I went to talk with the OB, and she said we should do an ECV before. And so I did it. So just in terms of like the ECV, how that went was we just arrived at the hospital, I don't know, I think at like 6 a.m. We had to wake up pretty early though.
So we live in
Chicago.
We used to live in Chicago. We recently moved this week. So Chicago is like 1 hour from Milwaukee. And that's where we went for ECV.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like we felt trust with that hospital and that doctor.
Yeah.
And so we went and tried the ECV because we were hoping that the baby will churn. And so we woke up at 4. And got there at 6.
Yeah.
To me, it was stressful, to be honest. Just seeing the kind of like the stomach and the baby like churning and monitoring the heartbeats going down. It was a bit frightening because I've never seen that before. And also I'm someone who doesn't go to the hospitals, right? Or hasn't been much in hospitals. So it could be different for someone who's used, like for my wife, she's a nurse. Things like that. Yeah. So for me, that was kind of scary.
I mean, so what had happened was the first time the baby did turn, and then he turned right back.
Yeah. Like during the procedure?
Yeah. And so they turned him, and then they waited, and then they did an ultrasound to check, and he had actually flipped back.
Wow.
And then what had happened after that, the doctor said they can do it again. And I said, okay. And so they did it. But then his heartbeat dropped considerably after that. And so it was like in the 40s for a while, and then it went back. And so we didn't want to do it again after that one. And so then that same doctor, after the procedure, she talked to us about what our options would be. And she said that we could do an ECV again in a week, or we would just plan to do a vaginal breech birth, or we could do a C-section at 39 weeks. And she gave us the risks and benefits of both. And then we decided that we would maybe try an ECV again, but we would definitely do the vaginal breech birth. Okay. And we wouldn't do the C-section. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe let's rewind a little bit and go back to, your search for a provider, because you were learning the research on these different options, and your baby was breached before you had the ECV. So the Chicago metropolitan area has a population of almost 10 million people. Mm-hmm. So are you telling me you could not find a doctor to do a breech vaginal delivery in Chicago?
None was willing. And I met with several, actually. It was very, very hard. And we ended up, when we went to Wisconsin and talked to the doctor there, because apparently all the providers, so the midwives, the CNMs, OBs, and the OB residents were all trained by Breech Without Borders in vaginal breech birth. And so they were offering it to
in Milwaukee.
In Milwaukee. And so when we went there, I had asked the OB, why was it that there was nobody in Chicago? And they said it was because it's something with malpractice insurance. However, I don't know 100% why, but she said you wouldn't find anybody in Illinois who would be able to.
Wow. Not a single doctor would do it.
Yeah.
So how far along were you when you switched to the Milwaukee providers then?
32 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was a later transfer. So
you started early, basically. Like you weren't waiting until your due date to figure this out.
Yeah, because I guess in my head I was like, I wanted to be comfortable with the providers as well. And I guess at the end of the day, I was like, Milwaukee isn't that far of a drive. I could go there and get the care that I needed. And even if the baby was head down, we would just still go there and have the baby there because it's just an hour away. But at least then we would have the option of both like just a vaginal head down birth or a vaginal breech birth if the baby stayed breech. It just made me feel more comfortable.
Knowing that whatever happened, you could have options. You wouldn't be forced into anything.
Yeah, that's what I was more worried about, was being forced into like something I wasn't 100% comfortable with. Yeah.
Also, the doctors in the Chicago area makes you kind of uncomfortable.
The one I had seen, it was, even before, it was very much like the OB it was all medicalized. And she was even like, after the 25-week ultrasound, we were talking with her, and she was kind of saying, well, you're small anyway, so you would probably need a C-section.
Wow. So she was already at 25 weeks, like telling you your body can't have a baby.
Essentially. Yeah.
So that was kind of
stressful
for my wife.
Yeah. I thought it was kind of frustrating.
And what's interesting too is when we went to his check right after birth with one of the pediatrician, and because we were staying in Wisconsin, north of Wisconsin, her parents' place, and there was this pediatrician was 1 hour away, and when we told them, oh, the baby was born vaginally, like breech, and they're like, oh, and they let you do that? So it shows like it is something that is kind of viewed as a C-section procedure. That's the only option.
Yeah, and it's not really an option if they tell you have to do it and there's no other choice.
Yeah, there wasn't. Yeah. So even at 25 weeks, they're kind of just saying you were going to have a C-section at least.
Yeah. And how does that work insurance-wise? Because I know in the United States, we do not have universal health care like some countries. Yeah. So what was involved to be able to go to another state? Was that a difficulty for you?
No, I am grateful that we have good insurance. So the insurance that we had allowed us to go out of states. And so I called just to verify, is this provider somebody that we can still see? And they said, yeah. And so it was pretty simple.
Pretty simple. That's good. That's good to hear. So what are some misconceptions or fears you had before your breech birth, and how did your knowledge evolve, from when you found out your baby was breech at 25 weeks to finding a breech-friendly provider at 32 weeks and then having your baby?
Yeah, so, initially, I felt comfortable with breech vaginal birth simply because I knew it was done
in other countries.
Yeah, and it was something where, yes, you do need to see a provider that's familiar with it, but it wasn't like, oh my God, they're doing something that could kill your baby.
Right.
So I felt comfortable with it. And so I just went on Breech Without Borders and I was looking through their database. They have an online directory, and the closest, there wasn't any in Illinois. But I did find the providers in Milwaukee. And so I went on the website of the hospital, called, and was like, this is my situation. I just want to see if I can be a late transfer. And it was actually, gratefully not hard to get an appointment with them.
That's awesome.
It was pretty straightforward.
Yeah. And Mohamed, what about you? Did you have any fears? I know you talked about the ECV being frightening and stressful, but when, as the pregnancy was progressing and Naoma was constantly trying to turn the baby, what were your feelings or thoughts about having a breech baby?
Well, because for me, I don't have much knowledge. I didn't have much knowledge about this. I was overall worried and scared because my mom had a tough experience when she gave birth to me, right? Mm-hmm. So overall, I was scared. But when I was looking at the research and seeing what it says, right, I tend to stick to that and focus. And one thing I read was the risk was, they said like 100% more. But in reality, that 100% was it something like from 1% to 2%?
I think it's like from 1 in 1,000 to 2 in 1,000.
Yeah, 2 in 1,000. So I'm like, well, that's not because it's kind of deceiving when you're 100% because you go, oh my God, that means definitely there will be something wrong.
Right.
But in reality, the number tells you no, it's just still a low risk and we should not worry about it. So looking at that made me more kind of hopeful about the situation. And one thing I would say that sometimes if we just listen to what other people say, the negative things, without looking at the data, that could be overwhelming. So it's always good to look at the data, the numbers, because they speak for themselves about an entire sample of population instead of 3 or 2 people.
So was there anything else you needed to plan for the birth because you were driving an hour or more away to get to the hospital? Like, in terms of when were you going to leave for the hospital?
I think we left too early, honestly. I think we almost left too early. Because it was also because we wanted to get there on time and I obviously hadn't had a baby before. So I wasn't sure exactly how long it would take me. We were both not sure how long it would take. And so we wanted to get there early enough. But when we got there, I was only like a centimeter dilated and like 30% of face. And so they just told us to walk around a little bit. And then at triage, then they checked me again. And I was like 2 centimeters and then 70% effaced. So they said like, maybe if you guys want to stay at a hotel tonight, that would make sense. And that's what we did. We stayed at a hotel.
We stayed for 3 hours and then we had to go back.
No, it wasn't 3 hours. We stayed there until maybe 3:30 in the morning, I think. Yeah,
we came around 11:30.
Oh, really?
11:30 p.m. And then we had to go back and because it started being more, so I had to time it. And it said, based on the timing, that we should go. Mm-hmm. But the delivery was not, it was still later. It was like...
it was like
5:20 p.m. So we were there at 3:30 a.m. and till 5:20 p.m. then it started. But for us, to be honest, part of me, I knew that we may be earlier there, but I wanted to be safe because driving an hour, I thought I didn't want like something to happen on the way, right? To wait and end up going to C-section or something we didn't desire. I knew we had doctors that were trustworthy in those hospitals, and it was worth it, to be honest, to go earlier.
Yeah. So Naoma, tell me what your labor experience was like. Take me through the process.
I'm trying to remember everything because, to be honest, I was so tired that like some of the bits and pieces I don't remember. But what I recall is once the contractions started, I wasn't actually sure if they were contractions. And then by middle of the day, I had called my husband to come, and we decided that we needed to go after we had packed our bags and stuff. And so then we started heading to the hospital. Then we had the thing where I hadn't progressed that much, so that we just went to the hotel. But once I was at the hotel, things started to be more like it got to the point where I couldn't really talk through the contractions, you know? So I just kind of felt like they would hit me like bricks, and it was all in my back. So it was a little bit harder, and they kept getting more painful. And so then once we we decided to go back to the hospital then, I guess at like, what, 3:30 a.m. you were thinking it was?
Yeah, 3:30. When we went to the hotel at 3:30 a.m., we went back to the hospital.
Yeah, and so then we went back, and I was 5 centimeters by that point.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, and like I was 5 centimeters, and they said it was 100% effaced.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they admitted me at that point. And then at the hospital, like, it was actually nice. I really liked the nurses. It didn't really feel like I had a breech baby. Like, they didn't really do much different. They would check his heartbeat every, I think it was like, I don't know how often the nurse came in. Do you recall? Because I wasn't on continuous fetal monitoring at all.
Yeah.
Until I had to push.
They had to come, I would say, every like 30, 40 minutes. They check something like that.
Yeah.
If I have to guess, yeah.
Yeah, and I was able to go in the shower, and the hot water kind of helped with the pain. They had other stuff too.
Other thing, there is like certain points. I don't know if there is scientific proofs about this, but I've read that it does help. There are certain points in the feet where you press that helps.
The acupressure points.
Yeah, and what I found out that the nurses there too were aware of them, so they were helping me doing it.
Yeah, and that was helpful. And then I guess the only thing is I couldn't get an epidural because the doctors wanted me to be able to move, especially during like pushing. So it was just kind of trying to manage the pain myself, and my husband was obviously supportive. I think though I did ask for, I forgot what it was called, Nubane or it was like morphine,
an opioid injectable in your IV then?
Yeah, just to kind of sleep because I hadn't slept for so long. And that helped. And then like obviously the pain picked up after a few hours, but it helped me just get some sleep. And then after I slept too, I was an 8, had progressed to 8 centimeters. So it helped, I think, just relaxing a little bit.
I think just doing the positions that a person is comfortable with, right? There is one thing that was helpful is we went to a birth class together, which was in the birth center of Chicago. And the birth center tends to focus on vaginal birth. And they showed us many techniques during labor. What to do.
Helped me with those.
Yeah, and that was helpful to be aware of, especially for husbands to attend, because sometimes, for example, my wife was in labor and she was in pain, and I had to kind of think about those movements and ask her, "There's this movement, do you want to do it?" And making sure the facility a person goes to has those
like the birth balls,
things like that to help.
So you used a lot of positions, Naoma. You used water, you had pain medication, and used birth balls and acupressure. It sounds like you had a lot of people and ways to help you stay as comfortable as possible.
Yeah. Really, to be honest, the contractions, like, they hurt, but it wasn't really until pushing where I felt like, oh, this was getting hard.
So what happened at that point? Like, what time was it when you were fully dilated, and what happened with that?
Because I had asked, I kind of lost track of time, but I asked the midwife after how long I was pushing, and she said like about an hour. So I think I must have like started at like 4:20.
The actual pushing.
Yeah.
In the afternoon.
Yeah, in the afternoon. They checked me. I was fully dilated, and then they said like, if you feel like you need to push, then you can push. But I didn't really feel like I needed to at that point. But what had happened too, though, is once they figured out I was fully dilated, that's when a lot of people started coming in. Like, I think they had and that got me nervous. That's
the only thing. If I had like feedback for them is, when a person is fully dilated and they especially looking to do things their own way, like vaginal for our case, to not have all the stuff coming, like the staff come in and stay there watching, because it was kind of scary, because you're like, okay, what if we took more time? Are they going to go to C-section? Right? And so that made her kind of like.
So there were people observing. Do you think it was maybe because it was a breech birth and people wanted to learn and watch who weren't actually there to help?
Could have been that, yeah.
But I had asked if they could ask me before. I had asked for no extra people if possible. Because like we're Muslim, and so I also didn't feel like 100% comfortable with like men there who weren't needed. But I don't know. I'm pretty sure the pediatric team was there.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of. It felt like there was a lot of people, and I think it was mostly because he was breech that they wanted.
Okay, so there was the pediatrics people waiting to make sure he was okay after he was born.
Yeah, it's just like what I felt like I didn't need to push at that point, but I was fully dilated. So I guess it was just like stressful for me because I was like telling them, oh, I don't know if I need to push yet. And they were like, oh, just be patient. But I was already nervous. And so I was like, I don't know. Now I feel like more anxious because there's so many people here.
People watching you. Yeah.
So that just made me, I think it made it more anxiety provoking for me. And then I wasn't 100% sure how to push either.
Yeah.
You know, so it took me a while to figure that out. I felt like, and my water broke during pushing too. So there's just a lot of sensations going on. So
did they ever tell you like what kind of breech position he was in? Was he complete breech or frank?
Frank, like his feet were like up, when he came out, they were up by they were like up by his face almost.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. I watched how he came out, and it was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Like coming out breech, because it's not like what we've seen in classes and stuff. Because he comes from his butt first, and it just looks like a piece of meat instead of head or something. And then the butt comes,
and the legs seem like they take forever to come out because they're all the way up by his face. Yeah,
yes. And then the feet kind of drop, right? The legs and the feet kind of drop after the butt, and then the head stays there, and that's where I was worried. Right?
Yeah.
When the head was the last part, because I heard stories that sometimes the head can get stuck.
Yeah.
But it was not the case for us. He was able to come out easily.
Yeah.
So were you in an upright birthing position, Naoma?
Yeah, I was on hands, and they wanted me to push on all fours. Like when I had talked to the OB, they said they wanted a like their goal was
physiological
breech birth, and so they said like unless they needed to do maneuvers, they wouldn't.
They weren't going to touch him, right?
Yeah. And so they didn't really. I guess I wasn't really paying attention because I was pushing at that point.
Yeah.
But
I think it was interesting when I attended the Breech Without Borders training. They showed us videos of the physiological breech births, and they show the standard maneuvers that the baby makes themselves. Like as they're coming out, and they kind of do these little stomach crunches that
I felt something in there. So.
Yeah, and then the head is tucked and comes out, so they don't want to interfere with what the baby does to get out, if that makes sense, unless there's an abnormality.
That's what they were telling me too. That like unless they noticed something, that they wouldn't be intervening unless they noticed something happening. And so the only other thing I was worried about too was because that previous OB who I had seen before I had switched to somebody who was like...
Who told you were too small.
Yeah, and so in my head, like, because when you're pushing, and I had never had a baby before, you're like, you know, it's just an odd sensation, and it's hard to tell if you're making progress or not, and it's painful too. So you're like, okay, this hurts. Am I making progress? And I'm not making progress. And then in my head, I was thinking, well, this OB was telling me I was too small. So I kept like thinking in my head, oh my God, what if I'm too tiny and it'll get stuck? But I mean, like once he came out, he was like crying and they didn't need to like suction him or anything. Wow. Actually, he was,
it was very normal. Yeah. Like, for me, when I went through that, like everything, the stories that I heard and reflecting back on the numbers, right?
Yeah.
It was, like I should always trust what the data tells me and follow that, because I looked at the birth that we had and it was like, thank thankfully, like everything was normal. It's not like all these frightening stories that
people share.
The only thing I would say for me, I wanted to go do it at a hospital instead of a home, and a home which is also normal, right? And I can see us doing it at home and nothing would happen. The only reason why I thought that is sometimes when you are in labor, there are people their mind can change in that time where they can't hold the pain, right? And they
make them change their mind about what they want.
For example, my wife during labor, because it was her first time, and she had those memories of what the doctor said and all that played, and she thought that she's not going to be able to get the baby out because she's too small, right?
Yeah.
And because of that and the pain, for example, she was calling for a C-section.
I started to, because
like, I need, that's it, I don't care, I need a C-section right now. I'm in pain. Wow. But she was associating that really just...
And I was scared.
What's
the other thing? I think that was... if the OB had never told me that you're too small, you would need a C-section anyway, I would have been more confident in myself. I think it was really at that point, like, just a lack of confidence.
It's very mental. It's a cognitive, you're in your head pushing the baby out.
Yeah.
Your own thoughts can work against you. And it's so sad that, I think a lot of physicians don't realize that what you say to someone when they're pregnant, when you're in a very vulnerable situation, that those memories stay with you and can impact your future.
And I honestly wish I was at that practice earlier, even if he wasn't breech, because I remember even asking one of the midwives, because you would rotate between midwives per appointment. And so I was talking to one and I just said, like, one of my doctors before told me this, is that like the case? And they were much more reassuring. Like your pelvis can, like, it will change during childbirth, and it's like, it's not going to stay in one place, it's dynamic. And like, they were much more reassuring and said that they didn't really have any concerns. But the problem is, because one person told me that just made me, especially...
You can't erase that memory of that person saying that.
Exactly. And like, when you're in a situation that's kind of high stress, you I feel like you fall back on that one memory.
Negative. Yeah, we tend to, you could have 99 people say something positive to you, and one person says something really negative about you or your body, and that you remember the negative thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's what happened. So, but gratefully, the midwives were very encouraging. They were like, "No, that's not what you want."
He's like, "No, that's not what you want."
And they knew you were almost there.
Yeah,
right?
And it was almost.
But that's also because why they stick to the plan too, and encourage it, because they saw her birth plan.
Yeah.
Right. He had. I've never seen other birth plans, but I can tell from doctors' faces they were surprised.
Yeah.
Because the birth plan was very...
That's way too detailed.
Very... Not too much content. It's not that. It's detailed and specific on what she's looking for, and has citations, right? For proof.
I did that.
And having that, doctors tend to be, I think, more careful and respectful, because you are citing, right, from reliable sources and research studies what it says, so they tend to stick with you through that. And I saw that, like, in the hospital, where they were more careful and to respect what she's looking for. And my advice, if there are people in the Chicago area or Wisconsin near Milwaukee, is to be honest, to go to the hospital. It's called Aurora Sinai, right?
I think so, yeah.
Aurora Sinai Center. It's what's interesting, that hospital, when you go there, you would not think it has those, like, really well-trained doctors, resources and stuff, because of its location in the city. You would think it's because of the location being maybe like a lower middle class or lower class, that the governments will not have something for the people, right, in the area. But in reality, it turns out totally different. That place,
Yeah.
it was very good place. And visiting places in Chicago, the hospitals that are even in, for example, near like Evanston, which is a well-off area, was not as good as the other one, which was great.
Yeah. No,
Looks can be really deceiving with
Yes.
hospitals and labor and delivery units. And so many hospitals put money into artwork and fancy buildings and, but then their staff have low morale or they treat their patients disrespectfully. So it's more about the people and the culture and not the building. And I think a lot of parents get confused.
And that's what I want to say. Like, for people to not go there and judge because of how the building
looks. Yeah.
Look at the staff, right? How do they treat others? Do they respect everyone, right?
Yeah.
No matter of religion or race. So those are the places to look for.
Because in Chicago, even with me, I had other issues where I saw an OB and they would make like discriminatory comments because I don't know if it was because I was Muslim.
Yeah. They start assuming things, for example,
that I'm abused.
For example, like if she wears a scarf because I asked her to wear it. No, and in reality, she wore it before even she married me. And in reality, even if I tell her to not wear it, she will actually yell at me and tell me why you're doing that, right? So when we go to even like some areas that could be dangerous to wear a scarf that are very rural, I tell her, hey, change that, and she tells me no, right? She wants to stick to her style, and people sometimes don't have like prejudice thoughts and they can treat you different based on faith or etc. So that's one thing why I'm saying don't judge a hospital based on the look.
Judge the building, judge on how they treat you. If they treat you with respect,
it's not about really the area where it's located. Or is this like a high-end area or not? It's about the people that work there and what are their values.
Yeah, it's so important. I want to hear a little bit more advice from you, but before we go, can you also tell us what did it feel like when your son was in your arms right after you gave birth?
Oh, it's the best. Like I mean, like it was almost like a shock. Like you don't even, I don't know. You go through that whole process of labor and pushing, and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, hey, now you can hold your baby," and I'm like, "Wait, it's done! Thank goodness!" And like you're holding them, and it just almost feels surreal. Like it doesn't even. It feels like you're literally dreaming. That's how I felt. I don't know. How did you feel?
No, for me, to be honest, it feels like, because I love soccer, right? It's like winning a World Cup. And it's like you're going through this kind of tough stage, right? You and your wife, and you're there to support her. And she's like almost like the player that tries to get the goal, right? And then when she scores that goal, which is giving birth, you feel like you have a trophy, more than a trophy. You feel like, oh my God, we did it, like as a team. And it was just beautiful. It makes you kind of forget about all that process.
You forget about all the other stuff and when you went to home.
Yeah. Is there any other advice that you want to share before we go?
I guess just if you feel confident, and I don't know, I think a lot of the times, at least for me, I used to not really stand up for myself with physicians, even when I felt like they weren't listening to me. And then once I became pregnant, I realized I kind of had to if I wanted to get what I wanted. And so I guess at the end of the day, if you don't feel supported by your OB or your medical team, there are resources where you can look up and find providers that are more receptive of, like, if the baby's breech birth, and if you're able to make an effort to go and see them, because you don't deserve to be kind of corralled into the birth plan that particular group. I guess maybe they think it's best, but if you have evidence to suggest otherwise, you should go with what you feel is best for you.
Yeah, for me, I would say, like, trust always the research, what it says, and sometimes it's good to be careful. There are research that is outdated, right? For example, regarding breech, a long time ago, there was research that says, there could be risks and this, but the most recent research shows the opposite.
That it can be, even though there are risks, like you can't, at the end of the day, any birth is going to have risks. And I think you have to calculate what risks you're willing to take and
assess based on that. The other thing I would say as advice for like people, other partners, would be like husbands, kind of like listen to podcasts about what other people go through, go to a birth class if possible, just to kind of be knowledgeable and on how to support during labor, because that's where when kind of like your wife or partner needs you the most, right? Mm-hmm. And it's good to be a good teammate, right? Instead of just a person that watches the process and let the nurses do everything, but being in there. Because, for example, my wife, I knew that she's going to remember if I don't support her through that, right? And it kind of stays in memory, right? Because that's like a very important, crucial time for that person. And that's where you kind of show that love and support is through action through that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It can reveal a lot about, your dedication to each other and your partnership and your teamwork. That's for sure. Yeah. Well, Naoma and Mohamed, thank you so much for sharing your story with our listeners. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to let our listeners know that, this is the fourth in a mini series we're doing about breech birth. So you can go to episode 296 to learn the evidence on breech birth. 297, we cover frequently asked questions. And 298, we talked with Dr. Emiliano Shabira about overcoming barriers to breech vaginal birth. And we are so thankful to Mohamed and Naoma for sharing their breech vaginal birth story. And we'll link to some other episodes in the show notes as well. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.